Proud. Welcome to everybody listening now and in the future. This is our free lecture on presence, resonance. What is it again, Jim? Presence, resonance, and
presence, relationship, and resonance.
Yes, welcome to everyone. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Jim Feil. Jim Feil has over 45 years in the study, practice, and teaching of energetic somatic and somatic therapeutic practices. His first career was as a teacher of English and American literature. He began his career in therapy by studying with the founder of polarity therapy, Dr. Randolph Stone, in 1970, and went on to earn his Doctor of Chiropractic degree in 1986. He began studying formative psychology with Stanley Kellerman in 1981, continuing until his passing in 2018. He has studied and taught craniosacral biodynamics with Franklin Sills and pre- and perinatal therapy, among other methodologies. He works with adults using verbal and body-oriented techniques, specializing in formative and somatic methodologies. He has taught in the U.S., throughout Europe, and in China. His work directs itself at helping individuals form themselves to effectively and competently respond to life transitions, challenges, crises, and opportunities. Please go ahead, Jim.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks, Kate. Welcome, everybody. So we have a little time this afternoon. I'm in Barcelona, so it's afternoon, and I guess most of you are in the States, so I guess it's morning, but we're all awake. I guess that's what joins us here. So we're going to spend an hour talking somewhat informally about obviously a very big topic, right? The presence, what could be bigger than that? Relationship, I guess the relationship could be bigger than that. And resonance. And so these are very big ideas, and we're going to touch into them in a particular way, hopefully of interest and hopefully in a useful way. You know, just to say that my interest, I'm here, and my interest is basically, for me, I want to be able to provide the best sessions I can to people who come and see me. And then my second interest is to support other people and help other people, providing the best sessions they can to whoever happens to come and see them, whatever their modality. And in a way, that's why I've picked this topic, because this presence, relationship, and resonance seems like it's relevant across almost every type of work that we might want to do with people. And I think what most of us are interested in, and what I'm interested in again also, is first just becoming as competent as possible at what I do. And then I really would like to move towards mastery. I think, that's my interest. What does it take to really move up that ladder of service that we can provide to people, where they get what they need for their lives and their process. And we also feel that we're really engaged in a way, using ourselves in a maximum way that is effective and satisfying. So in order to do that, we first, I think, need clear ideas. You know, what I'm going to say may not be so new, but I think it's critical to return to it. I don't know. I don't know if Vince Lombardi is still kind of known in America the way he was when I was a kid, but he was, of course, one of the great football coaches, the Green Bay Packers. And he was once asked, what was the secret to his great success? And he said, he thought about it, and he said, well, what we do every practice session, we do blocking and tackling, which is the most fundamental, simplest process you can do in football. And they practiced it every day, if only for a few minutes. The most fundamental stuff, they kept returning to it, just like musicians practice their scales. There's always something more there that helps you refine your work and polish it and deepen it. So that's a little bit of why I chose this topic, because presence and relationship and resonance are topics that can continually be polished and continually add nuance and refinement and depth to our work. So we really need to have clear ideas about these big topics, and clear ideas in terms of, the big picture. Presence gives us a very big picture. but there's also a lot of precision in it. That presence has a precision. It has there are details that are very important. There's a lot of very specific elements that make presence and relationship and resonance so powerful in their effects. So we need to have very clear ideas. And it's interesting. I talk to a lot of therapists, and sometimes I ask them, about the key ideas and the key principles in their work. And I have to admit that sometimes I get a pretty fuzzy response. The response is either fuzzy or it's very kind of programmatic. It's kind of the program of what they learned in their training. That's useful, of course. But, I think engaging ideas, each one of us, and articulating them and in a way, continuing to find ways to communicate them effectively and fluidly is so important. So we want to clarify our ideas. We want to get lots of experience, right? That's the other thing, right? We need to have lots of experience at doing what we're doing, whether it's good or it's bad, but lots of experience that we can reflect on. Experience isn't enough. You have to reflect on it. And experience is very tied into, of course, doing the enactment of our work. Yeah. And so, that's practice, right? And so this combination of experience and enactment, experience and doing. And in a way, we should wake up in the morning, jump out of bed and say, if there's nobody on my, in my diary, I'm going to work on my dog. I'm going to work on, somehow I'm going to be practicing, right? Remember, shadow boxers. Boxers are always up there shadow boxing. There's nobody there, but they're practicing their moves. They're warming. And so I think there's a certain kind of engagement. If we really want to move to competence and mastery, really engage the work constantly in as many ways as we can. Yeah. And so putting our ideas into action, getting experience from them constantly, and trying out different protocols, different strategies, and, just really experimenting and getting over any resistances to that, right? Not having to look good, not having to really get the perfect results, just engaging our work with that kind of, excitement and experimentation. And out of all this, right, out of the ideas, out of the experience, the enactment, eventually the work gets embodied in us. And that's when something additional happens, right? When something is embodied, we go into what's called that unconscious competence that's so widely talked about, right? Because something really becomes mine. In a way, it becomes highly personalized, right? And so what Jim does is going to be it's going to have my mark on it, and then that's going to be different from what Kate does, or what Violetta does, or what Jeremiah does, right? When we embody it, we give it both a universal form and a personal form, and that's when we really engage the work in its real possibilities. Yeah. And it becomes very creative, right? When you really embody something, you're free enough that you can be creative and and really maintain the spirit of the work. Yeah. And you also develop that great ability to improvise, right? So like the great jazz musicians and even some of the classical musicians, right? When you have that musicianship really established in you, then there's nothing like the free form of improvisation, which takes everybody into other realms. So yourself and your client, and things start to happen in the session that really don't happen otherwise. Yeah. It's wonderful to have protocols, to have clear, to have nicely refined technique and all of that. And that will take you a long way. But when you get to the point where that is embodied and you can really start to improvise and start to individualize in further ways, That's really the work in the way I think most of us would love to be able to express it. So, okay, let me give you a few slides. Let's change the modality for a moment. And just take a look at some pictures that I think are relevant to what we're talking about. And then we'll go back, get a little deeper into the topic itself. Good. How's everybody doing? We're okay. Rhythm is okay. Good. Okay. People understanding me. Great. Okay. So let's do a little share here. And good. And now we'll go into from the start. Okay, presence, right? So I don't think we have to stay here long, but this is about presence. So I'm going to show you the first picture is about presence as an archetype, right? So this is probably the ultimate vision of presence, yeah? And I think what it does capture is that sense of presence starts with a deep inward look, right? Uh, and um, and so presence starts with our authentic self, however we conceive of it. Yeah. And so in a way, you know, you can see it kind of gives us our that beautiful verticality. We are in relation to our core, our depths, and in relation to something much bigger than ourselves. And that's where presence begins. You don't necessarily have to meditate to have presence, but this is the classic vision of presence. So this is kind of maybe one image that gives us the ideal of what presence is like. And then, of course, we can go to this is another vision of presence. Here, everybody is present in their own way each day, right? And we can see three generations of presence, right? And so that's, of course, what we have to build on, And so presence has many ways of expressing itself, yeah. But most of these aren't very therapeutic, but it's where some of us go, right? And this is the best we can do on some days as far as presence goes, just because life is what it is, or the moment is what it is. Yeah. But let's go back to some other more idealized visions of presence, right? Here, this is compared to the Buddha picture. This is presence, still inward, but here we can begin to see this particular figure surrounded by all those great inner resources, right? Here we have, he's still inward, but, he's still dreaming about or thinking about the gods and his spirit guides and whatever. But the outer world is there waiting for him to come, and he's got his resources and his tools. So presence, and also in a way, is our preparation for stepping out. Yeah. And so it's a place we gather. We gather ourselves, we gather our resources, and in a way, we really begin to prepare for what is the next step. Yeah. Whoops. Why is, let me see now. Okay, there we go. Here's another version. And this is already, you can see a figure starting to step out, right? From looking inward, the look is out, right? The hand is already making a gesture outward. And the first step in engaging the outer world and engaging the process of relationship. Yeah. And you can feel the power that's just in potential, ready to move out. Yeah. So all of this in presence has many different dimensions, but I read a book recently on presence, popular self-help book, but it was interesting. And it says, bringing your boldest self to your biggest challenges, right? So that's what this author feels is presence, our boldest self to our biggest challenges. And I think this particular Indian god looks like he's ready to do that. That's a bold self, and he looks like he's ready to take on those big challenges. Yeah. So, whoops, I think, yeah. So let's see, let's go. There we go. So next is relationship. Well, I think we all have our take on relationship. I don't know if I can add to it, but there's the primal relationship. Henry Moore showing us the family, right? And of course, as far as I'm concerned, presence, relationship, and resonance are all about actions. They're all about forms, right? Even presence, as you saw, it's an action. It's an organized pattern. Even in deep meditation, the Buddha figure is still organized physically. It's an organized action. And relationship and family is also organized action. We can see it in the forms. We see the relationships, right, between the two parental figures and the way they hold the child. And this is this is a beautiful expression of just an archetypal family form, right? And this is the fundament of relationships, right? And then we can take it a million places. So I just selected two or three images just to kind of bring relationship into the conversation in a visual way, right? This one you've probably seen many times, but I don't think I can look at it enough. So that looks like they're in relationship, I would say, right? And in a way, they seem to be enjoying relationship. Yeah. And I think this is a great potential for all of us as well. Not that we do this with all our clients, but it's kind of a feeling that and a sense of tenderness and connection and intimacy and just sheer pleasure that is nice to somehow have as a reference for us, right? Um, and then another image of relationship. Let's see. There we go. Now, this is also for those of you who studied the social engagement system, a little bit of polyvagal. This little dog seems to understand polyvagal without having it taught in a seminar, right? And, talk about eyes that relate, And so I was sitting there, and I'd just taken my shoes off. And clearly the question is it okay if I chew on your shoes? And of course, what could I say to that look? I said, of course, right? So we were having a dialogue, wordless, but quite an exchange right there. Yeah. And this is being in relationship and being available to whatever happens to show itself in the moment, right? Here's another relationship, right? Renoir also understood a thing or two about relationship, right? And here again, we can see relationship is most powerfully expressed through gesture, through posture, through look. No words here, but I don't know how, as they say, how many words it would take to communicate the relationship that is hoped for or is in process in this particular picture. So just to get a few little feelings about what we're talking about with relationship. And then we go into resonance. And resonance, of course, we'll talk about each of these a bit more, of course. And then resonance is, so, there's my buddy. And, you can tell he's sitting there telling me his story, thinking deeply about his past history, And I was kind of amazed at, how many things we had in common, And so, kind of that this is a side by side resonance, the kind of the comparison seems apt, right? And so anyway, so this is kind of one sense of resonance, even though he's from a different culture and has a different profession, but I feel I can relate. I feel like in my profession of therapy, I'm always having to deal with bulls that are trying to gore me, And so there's a lot of stories that we could tell each other that are quite resonant and we can learn from each other, right? Another quick view of resonance is this, where all of a sudden, a lady walking through the museum recognizes herself in a work of art, right? And what it looked like a very powerful little moment of recognition and resonance. Wow, look at this! I am a work of art. Anyway, so just we when we start to look at this topic of presence, relationship, and resonance, it's everywhere and we can learn about the details as well as the principles. So, Okay, I guess we're back. Yeah. Good. So, this is kind of in the time we have a little bit of an hour. So it's mostly a one-way street. I will have moments where you can kind of ask questions or make comments. But at least the way I understand webinars like this is it's mostly one-way street, particularly short ones. So I hope it's okay for you. Um, so as I said, the idea of not just presence, relationship, and resonance, but all of the great ideas that are wonderful guideposts for our work. Yeah. They're actually all about action. When we talk about ideas, we're really talking about action. And so presence also is an action. Yeah. Now, maybe we don't think about it so much that way. We think about it, well, it's a kind of feeling. It's a kind of, right? But to get to that feeling, there's a way in which we need to use our bodies. We need to organize ourselves. We need to act. And even if it's a subtle action, yeah. And so presence, again, there's so much that can be said about presence, but at least, and as I mentioned in the kind of the description of the talk, this will be a little bit of a personal journey through these topics. So I'll be talking about my take on them and how I understand them and use them. But for me, when I move into presence, I'm moving into what I call, what has been called by many, a kind of a neutral place. Yeah. And neutral, of course, is not a passive place, but it's a place that doesn't have really a charge or a direction of its own in the moment. Yeah. I think the easiest metaphor is just neutral in a car gear shift. You need that neutral in order to move into the other gears. If you don't have neutral, your car only has one gear. So the neutral is your access point. From that neutral, you can go into 4 gears forward, 1 gear back. You can shift gears. The neutral gives you that particular orientation that enables you to go everywhere and adjust your speed and so forth and drive safely. And so it's actually incredibly functional. It holds in a way the potential of everything, but it's neutral. It in itself doesn't have a direction, doesn't have a motion, right? And so we could go into this idea of neutral, quite extensively. But it also gives me, as we mentioned a little bit before, the presence gives me access to my internal resources. So it's neutral, but it gives me access. And it creates an inner space, right, which I can then use as a kind of a model for how I move into outer space. Yeah. And it has also to do with acceptance, with permission, right? I permit myself to occupy my body the way I do, to be how I am and who I am. Yeah. And the presence creates a certain readiness, an inner readiness. When I work with people, before I actually engage the work, we may be talking, we may be interviewing, but before we actually start into the work, something in me ideally says, yes, we're ready to go, right? And I think so. I think presence is about establishing our own inner readiness, so that when we really start to move with the other, with the client, whatever, I am ready to go, right? I'm warmed up, I'm neutral, right? And just, you know, there's a yes in me. I can't always have the yes in the fullest sense I would like, but it's a reference for me. I'm present. I'm present for me. I'm present for you in this moment, and let's move forward. Yeah. And of course, presence is also built on everything we are, right? And it's not just a free floating inner state, right? my constitution is part of my presence. If let's say Arnold Schwarzenegger sits down next to you, he has a certain presence because of his constitution, even though he doesn't work. If he didn't work out, his mesomorphic constitution would create a very powerful presence next to you, which you would have to somehow interact with. If Obama, kind of skinny ectomorph, kind of sat down next to you, it would be a very different presence, right? And so our presence, of course, is conditioned by our constitution, and it's conditioned by our whole history. Yeah. But what we want to be able to add to that when we're talking about the neutral is that I have my history, I have my constitution, I have my experience also as part of my resource, but I also have that neutral, which enables me to engage people very different from me, with different constitutions, different histories, different needs. Yeah. And so presence does all of that. It engages our experience, engages who we are, makes all that available, and also gives us the possibility to dance. And working with presence is it's obviously something we can work with. There's certain, how I use what I have. So, Arnold can decide he's going to be a powerhouse in the moment, or he can say, I understand how my physical presence conditions other people's response to me. And he can work to soften it. He can work to take a step backward. He can soften his voice. So, using his presence, understanding of presence, he can use himself in many different ways. And so, there's a whole art to building presence so that we are both fully there and that we have a space that's really open and permissive and accepting. Anyway, so that's a little bit of a take on presence. And presence, as we work on it and build it and practice it, gives us a certain poise, and that poise is really necessary when people bring difficult stories, into the treatment room. Yeah. Um, and it empowers us in a way. Um, so that's a little bit about presence. Yeah. So if we really had a little bit more time, we could do some simple exercises on presence. Yeah. And since we don't have that kind of time, I'm going to just more suggest it. But for example, we said that presence, is about connecting with a kind of inner space. That's certainly one dimension of it. So an exercise we could do is, okay, so you yourself imagine how do I organize inner space in me? It's not just a mental thing. You literally, and maybe in very subtle ways, right, actively organize space. Yeah. So that it's a full body experience. It's not just an idea, but that it's a full body experience. And when it becomes a full body experience, it's going to have a different effect on the other. Yeah. Presence might also kind of in a way be a safe space. If you're thinking about what presence and what qualities of presence have for you, you might think of it, okay, well, presence is also a place of safety. So, your exercise would be, okay, you create space. And now how do I add to that mix some safety? What do I do to kind of establish safety? Maybe safety space might be somewhat more like this, and safety might be somewhat more like this. Right? Where I have more ground, I'm more stable, and I offer a more stable presence to the other person. Um, Maybe presence is also about slowing, right? So that as an exercise, you can kind of take the different qualities that you understand of as presence and build them in as subtle actions. and see what happens. Yeah, so I think that, that's a nice exercise. Presence is also about freedom. How do you build freedom into the same space? So anyway, so I'm going to leave you to do that. If we had more time, we could do the exercise and feedback and see and so on. But anyway, that's a bit about presence. Okay, I'm going to take a breath, have a little slug of water. Everybody still okay? Still with me? No? Any thumbs? Okay, good. Okay, thank you. Good. So out of presence, we step into relationship. Yeah. And as we saw from some of those images, there is a stepping in. Now, often when we work, I've seen this in a lot of people, the movement from whatever presence they may have centered a little bit, grounded a little bit, and then they are out fast towards the other. And, the process of stepping out from your presence, a lot of people, somehow they build a beautiful internal presence. And next thing they know, they're out and they're, all that wonderful work that they've done to set the presence up kind of is gone, because now, now they're in the work. They're really looking, they're mental. What do we do? What do we, and the stepping out process, as we saw in that one image where, wow, okay, I'm ready to step out, right? Kind of a reminder. So we begin to step out into the space we've created. We make the inner space a bit more three-dimensional, and we establish a space that the two of us are going to shape together. Yeah. So there's a lot of, names for this kind of mutual space that we are now interacting in relationship. Yeah, it's called the intersubjective field, right? Um, it's also called a co-regulated field, right? Each one of them kind of, has its kind of focus and purpose, right? So it's a co-regulated field. So in a sense, we're looking to establish a kind of support self-regulation by co-regulating, right? And that's a whole process in itself, and a whole part of the art of relationship is helping each other co-regulate, whether it's emotional or arousal or anxiety, whatever's moving and needs to somehow settle, be regulated in some way. The relationship is an opportunity for this co-regulation. And also there's a kind of what's been called a co-bodying, right? As a way, mommies give babies their bodies as a way, in a way. There's a lot of co-bodying, which goes beyond, I think, co-regulating. It's a kind of supporting a whole forming process in engaging challenges and situations in life. So anyway, there's a lot of ways that relationship has been talked about, and it's a huge topic. Um, but I think one of the main things about relationship is that it needs a lot of nuance, right? I think we've seen, you relate to somebody, you add, a little bit too much, intensity in your voice. You make a little gesture, and it can create big waves for the other person, right? So when we're engaged in this relational field, there's a way, it's a field of a lot of gradations, a lot of intensities. And so that's part of the art of working in relationship, is to begin to manage our own intensities, whether they're mental or emotional or just in terms of our motivation in the work. So that's a lot of the art of relationship, is managing ourselves, right? Relationship is all about sending and receiving. Yeah. And that balance is sometimes very hard to get, right? Some therapists are big senders. I've seen them, they just send and send. And then the client becomes a big receiver. Maybe that's their general pattern, or they have to be a big receiver because the therapist is teaching them and telling them so much, and right? Or the other way around, you've got a client who has just got so much to tell you and has got to tell you their life story and then their past life stories, and right. And so the art of relationship is really how we manage this whole process of sending and receiving, and how individualized it is between people. And so a whole bunch of stimuli and signals and responses. And so managing the sending receiving process, as simple as it sounds, ain't so simple, right? And it's a whole art of working with that particular conversation and polarity. Part of that relational field is also regulating distance and closeness, right? Some people are by nature cooler, more mental, more observers, and they kind of keep a certain kind of distance. That's their preference, right? Others are closer, warmer. They want to get into more intimate spaces, right? And that again is another polarity, another critical conversation, right? Where the therapist, I think, is quite clearly the person who has to adjust, right? Of course, the client's going to have to adjust somewhat to the therapist, but I think the therapist's role is much more actively regulating, how close do I need to get to be able to support this person in this particular difficulty? How much do I need to take a little bit of distance so that they can struggle on their own and work something out and clarify? Yeah. And so this process of how close, how distant, and I'm not just talking physically, but in just the feeling that we have in relation to one another, that takes a lot of work and a lot of perception. Yeah. And again, we need to know how we work, what our preferences are, and be able to differentiate that from a client's needs and preferences. Yeah. And then that's it's a lot of fine crafted work to regulate distance and closeness. Again, like anything, as we said before, at first, we do it, trying things out, learning, making all kinds of mistakes and this and that the other, and then over time we refine it and embody it. And I think at a certain point you can develop and embody a very nice sense of the moment to get a little bit closer, and how close. Maybe it's just a centimeter in the field, and then how to distance and how to back and forth. So this is all about, of course, connection and separation. Yeah. And exactly how I reach out to somebody and how I withdraw. So these are fundamental things. I think everybody understands the words, and I think also the importance. But I think where the challenge is to really learn how to engage these conversations in a really refined way with somebody else. So how do you reach out? There are actually many ways to reach out. You can reach out with your eyes, with your voice, with your hands, right? And same thing. How do you give distance? How do you stay connected when there's more distance? you know how do you become closer and yet keep a certain distance? So all of this is really the art of the work. Yeah. And of course the same thing with there's so many of these kind of polar conversations that organize the relationship. How much empathy, how much challenge, right? And if there's some people who are just so empathic. Yeah. And of course there are therapies that talk about how that's the critical thing. But of course sometimes somebody needs a bit more challenge, a bit more, okay, let's go looking for your adult. We can't just always empathize with the wounded child layers, which of course we need to be able to do. So, so that relationship has this kind of polar quality of the various poles that we've been talking about: sending, receiving, distance, closeness, and then all the different gradients, right? And so if I have a certain impulsivity, if I see somebody hurting, some people just, oh, they just, their empathy is so strong, they have to go towards them, you know. If I don't have the ability to manage that gradient of closeness, we can both start getting caught in patterns that we've lived out all our lives. And the whole point of the presence and the relationship is to build a field where we can see what a person has formed in their lives, what their patterns are, also, you know, what's somehow making them miserable or what's difficult, and creating a space where that can be appreciated, that can be seen, and then we can have ways of managing distance and closeness and loneliness and connection that create a different field. And as you can see, this is all very somatic. It's somatic, and it's what we call formative. Yeah. And so we use, in this work, we use all of us, right? We use our cortex, but we also use our brainstem. We use the body in its fullness, because these are very real points of communication. Yeah. And so, anyways, that's a bit about relationship. Huge topic, but that's the, you know, the art of the relationship is really something, like I said, it's a lifelong process. Yeah, and our lives will teach it to us if we pay attention. Yeah. And then the third topic that is so critical, I think, in effective therapy is is this process of resonance. Yeah, and you know, and resonance is this kind of quality of attunement. Yeah, which is, you know, obviously it has something to do with relationship, it has something to do with presence, but I think it's useful to differentiate it a little bit. And so, you know, building a kind of attunement, yeah, where the interaction itself, you know, through all of the rhythms that we've been talking about in relationship, a certain fluidity begins to happen, a certain rhythmic exchange. It becomes rhythmic, maybe even without even realizing it, a back and forth, a rhythmicity, which builds a certain kind of sensitivity in the relationship. A certain sensitivity grows, and and that sensitivity is actually becomes very wave-like, very right. It's like tidal in a sense, and it connects us to the deep pulsations of the body, because of course pulsation underlies everything, right? We live because we pulsate, and the study of pulsation is a whole other dimension, which some of you may have also studied in your own ways. But there's a way in which every stimulus is a waveform, you know, physiologically, of course, visual, it's a visual wave going through the nervous system, right? Light waves or sound waves or pressure waves. So fundamentally, we are kind of processors of waveforms, which give us information about the environment and ourselves. And so there are ways of working with resonance and slower and faster rhythms, which send very, very interesting qualities of feeling and sensation through the body, full of information and full of kind of an internal reorientation. So again, I probably don't have any simple exercises right now for working with relationship and resonance, but I think you probably have plenty of your own. And just again, taking hold of those three primary, great ideas that we can use to build a competence in mastery. And of course, there are others, right? I mean, I chose presence, relationship, and resonance because they seem to be a nice set. But of course, the term boundary, which everybody has heard a million times, this is where it's been interesting. As much as boundary is talked about, I really get a lot of fuzzy responses when I ask people to tell me what boundaries are, you know. And I think that's an interesting exercise. You can ask each other, okay, what's a boundary? And to see what comes out. Yeah. And because boundary, when you think about it as a membrane, of course, the cell membrane is what enables life to exist as we know it. Yeah. So boundary isn't just being able to say no and establish a boundary and establish a certain integrity or and don't pass it, and that, which is what I get a lot about around boundary. Yeah. Um, but of course, it's one of the most powerfully functional kind of dimensions of who we are and how we work. And of course, boundaries can be very firm, they can be semi-permeable, they can be really open. Yeah. And so, the whole discussion around boundary is one of the great ideas, which then needs to be experienced in many ways, enacted, and also embodied, would be another great topic. Even a topic like safety, which these days is talked about so much. You begin to try to articulate it yourself in your own words, and a lot of people struggle with it. Yeah. So, so anyway, all of these things really are lifetime tasks. Yeah. And it's really worth trying to articulate these in your own words. Not that you can't use words you've learned as well. Yeah. Um, Good. So we're moving along, and I'll say a few more things, and then we'll open it up to a few questions if you have some. Um, so basically, you could think of presence, relationship, and resonance as three different types of contract. Yeah. So presence, of course, is a contract with yourself. Yeah. You enter into a contract with yourself. Yeah. Well, I'm going to be present first to myself, to what's going on in me, to who I am, to how I function, you know. Because if you don't really have an ever growing sense of how you function, you know, then of course, I don't know, what do you bring into the session? You bring a certain technique, a certain perspective, but of course, you're bringing in how you function, both in your natural constitution and in the history that you have integrated. And so, presence is a contract with yourself about how you would like to be in any one moment in order to engage the work and engage another. Yeah. So relationship, of course, is a contract with somebody else. It doesn't have to be a written contract signed by lawyers, but there's our certain agreements in how we relate. Yeah. If you're a psychoanalyst, of course, the agreement is you're going to be interpreted. The therapist is going to interpret you and tell you what you do and what your patterns are. Right. A lot of interpretation. You know. In other styles are very directive. Other styles are very non-directive. And then how you do things as a therapist yourself. All these things are contracted either somewhat explicitly or implicitly, but in a way there is a contract. I will not manipulate you. I will not take advantage of you. I will, as much as I can, respect your individuality and your individual needs and how you need to do things, right? These are all, well, like I say, a combination of implicit and explicit contracts with the other. Yeah. And then the resonance, you could say, is a contract with the larger life field, this larger life field of pulsation and exchange, which keeps us alive, keeps us growing, and it's kind of a contract with this larger field sense, of exchange with the world, biological, ecological, and however you want to think about it. So we are engaged in agreements and contracts. And all of this ultimately is in service of our forming, our becoming more of what we naturally are and building on layers of who we want to be and how we want to function. And so the PRR is really in the service of our human form and the possibilities of that form, and to help it continue to form in ways that are satisfying and useful to the community. So, and then finally, and then we'll open it up to questions. There's a lot more, but obviously an hour goes by fast. All of this is a process of orientation. You could call it that. And if you think about one of my metaphors, like after all, here we are, we're working with ourselves and working with other people. And just to think about how much active orientation has to happen there. And some therapies teach us some of that orientational process, and some teach parts or not at all, depends. But I mean, if you're just learning how to drive, you need to actually orient to the car. And orienting, again, is what we were talking about earlier. It's a mental process. You have clear ideas about the car. You need to experience the car. You need to enact. You need to feel the car. And you have to, in a way, embody the car. Yeah. So you orienting to the car, steering wheel, brakes, all of it. Then you have to orient to the road, right? What kind of road are you on? What kind of curves? What kind of bumpiness, right? And so then you have to orient to other cars and the traffic, and you have to orient to the rules of the road and the etiquette, right? And then you actually have to orient to who you are as a driver. How much do you love speed? How safe are you, right? All of that. Who are you as a driver? So driving is a huge orientational process, which we do partly consciously and partly unconsciously. Yeah. And so it's the same thing with this work, right? It's a process of continual orientation to who I am, who I'd like to be in the work, what are the purposes of the work? Who is the other person coming into this whole field? Yeah. And so we're constantly orienting ourselves. And in a world that is highly entangled, highly embedded, highly networked, right? And it's a complicated world. It's a very complicated world. And so everything we do in terms of learning the work is about managing this awesomely complex world. So, okay, well, I don't know, why don't we give you guys a chance to ask some questions and make some comments, or however, bring you into the step out of your presence into the relationship here. So
Yeah, so we're welcoming interaction and questions. And if there's 2 pages of you, so I won't be able to see you raise your hand. What I'd like you to do is just open your microphone, and we can welcome you to ask a question, and Jim can respond. I can put you both up so that there's an interaction that happens between the 2 of you. So please, what questions, comments?
Hello, Kate.
Violetta.
Yes, thank you. Jim, thank you so much. I tell you, as soon as you started talking, my heart was softening and tears welling up just from nothing, just from you starting, really opening this field, and how simple that is. And I'm sitting here in the UK and you're talking, and the whole subject just reminds me of how to be as a human. You're talking here, us being therapists, and really how to be human. And I observe myself how recently I haven't been with my recent neighbor, and where the resonance is, where the lack of it, and where I'm breaking off. And it's just a sweet, sweet, sweet reminder. It's not just in our office. It's when I step out, and how to be. It's just delightful how you put it. And I really enjoyed your voice, your intonation as well. It just really was a pleasure listening to you and reminding, yes, it's a big yes from me. Great. Thank you. Just to you and the whole group, and thank you for bringing that amazing, I suppose, humanity into the field.
Well, thank you, Violetta. Very nice. I certainly appreciate hearing it. I'm glad that it reached you that way. So thank you. Thank you. Great. We'll take it. We'll take it. Good. So anybody else? You don't have to copy Violetta. That's beautiful if you do, but you can.
Jim, I have a question while we're waiting for other questions.
Okay.
You had in your talk, you gave a couple of suggestions that, well, come up with your own words to define these things, and that you've interviewed therapists and you've asked them about the work, and there's been kind of this fuzzy response. So I would like to challenge.
Not always, but often enough. Yeah.
Well, I would like to challenge myself to come up with my own language for the things that you consider we should, or just, and one of them was boundaries, another one was presence. But is there other more words on that list that you would recommend that we become more exact and fluent with, or?
A lot of big words that people, just support, for example. Support is such a simple word. And, and of course, therapy and other professions are professions that support people in their process in different ways. And what exactly is support for you? How do you think about it? What are your images for support? How do you enact it, right? Are you a motherly supporter, a fatherly supporter, a tough love supporter? How would you go about kind of defining support, right? And how you do it, and so forth. So that would be a big one, along with these others, for example.
Thank you, Jim.
Sure.
Sicily.
Thank
Sicily,
you.
are you from Italy? No, anyway, Sicily.
No,
Okay.
the island kicked out of Italy. No, I live in India. I'm from Bangalore,
Okay,
India.
great,
And
great. Welcome.
thank you. I had this lovely image when you talked about boundaries. Most of the time, we look at boundaries as something that is separating, separating two people or people. And when you talked about it, this image that came was this semi-permeable, uh, interaction, the giving and the taking. And also that brings me to, sometimes as therapists, we think we need to just give. But for me, out of every session that I offer, there's so much of receiving. I feel so energized, so much of wellness that comes out of offering, giving. In giving, there's also that receiving, and that's what
Right.
stood out so much for me. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful.
And
Yeah,
everything else, the resonance and everything that comes with that.
I think
Yeah,
it's
thank you
always
so
a
much.
pulse, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because that's how life works, right?
Mm-hmm,
Great, nice to hear that. Okay, very good. Thanks, Cicely. Good.
thank you.
Yeah. Mm.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
I
Cicely.
mean, Kellerman's one of my big teachers. He had a very nice, he says, some people say in the beginning was the word, but he says, what I sometimes say, in the beginning was the line, right? Because the line, which is the boundary, is kind of what makes life as we know it possible. Yeah. Very, simple, but and then of course, how does this line work, right? And everybody knows building boundaries is such a critical piece to health, right? What we let in, what we let out, what we don't let in, and so forth. So great, good. So anything else? Anybody else?
We have time for one more question or comment. Donna.
Yeah, I have a comment. I think more than, I don't have a formed question yet. I'm just really appreciating, Jim, all of your language around this, and the importance of really starting to bring more attention to these concepts in our therapeutic work. I trained as an occupational therapist in the 80s, and, our orientation was a very biomechanical model of practice at the time. The social piece wasn't even part of it. And now we're starting to talk, biopsychosocial model, but still there's this whole, I hear you, speaking and working a little bit more on a bio-psycho-spiritual model, that just even has a bigger field and a bigger container. And that's just some of my language. But I was thinking about a client I recently had. I'm currently working in a girls' youth residential center, and very adverse childhood experiences, and the majority have been human trafficked. And it was a teen that came out of a classroom, and she just fell to the floor in despair, in the hallway, and just couldn't do anymore. And it was interesting to me to watch. Some staff wanted to approach, get into this mental processing right away, and the teacher, wants to go into boundaries right away, and you got to get this figured out. Everything in life can't trigger you, and it's like,
Right. Wow.
Watch some of that, and they know my role as the OT is just to be there to self-regulate and co-regulate. And I came up and I invited her to come into my space, and she just couldn't even make eye contact or respond. And so I just sat on the floor next to her, across from her, and faced her, and just really consciously chose to do some presence and co-regulating with her, through breathing and some heart coherence practices. And we stayed there for about 20 minutes, and she eventually just curled up into it. At first she was very clear. The only thing she spoke was, do not touch me. That was her boundary, and she was very clear about that. And I respected that and honored that. And as I stayed in co-regulation and coherence with her, she eventually curled up into a fetal ball and snuggled up next to me, on her terms. And we just stayed there until she was ready to experience something different, and then was able to get up and rejoin the group with no verbal language, exchanged. And so I'm fascinated, and I think there is so much to all this presence and resonance and relationship. And I guess if I have a question, my bigger question is, how do we keep getting this out into the therapeutic world? That some people will look at me and think I did nothing. Like, what did you do? Like, you just sat there, you didn't do anything therapeutic. They can't see it yet. And I'll have a classroom teacher, will say, well, how come I always have to be the bad guy and put all the boundaries down, and she sees me as soft. And so it's interesting of how we have to all keep working and moving forward to understand these deeper parts of therapeutic relationship.
The power of the field, right? This resonance quality, right?
Yeah.
And that's, of course, a critical piece in this kind of whole somatic formative vision. And like you felt that, it was a quality of presence, but that already sends a kind of a wave into the field, which is perceivable, even if it's kind of implicit, a bit unconscious, but it has an effect. Yeah. And we can leverage that. The more we appreciate this field, relational field, intentional field, and we can work with it, it gets more powerful and begins to organize, a response in someone, and then of course we can add to that thing, words that kind of resonate with the field. They're not just, like you said, people who have ideas and they're trying to impose them, but there's already a kind of a resonant quality, a connected quality, which is pretty unspoken. And then you can add words to it. You can add, tones to it. You can select, when you read the person's form, she's totally disorganized and kind of out of control, but there's still something in her trying to form, because nobody likes being out of control, but she just doesn't know how to do it. Mm-hmm. And so when you begin to appreciate this kind of formative principle, that people are always looking to try to find a stable form, but they don't know how to do it. They're overwhelmed. You begin to gives you other leverage points and other ways in to stabilize somebody a bit more quickly, and then help them contain and stabilize. Sure. But that's wonderful that you had that experience, and that you saw other people jumping out from a different perspective and a different frame, you know. Yeah, great.
Thank
Okay.
you, Donna, for that story and that example. And thank you, Jim, for your response.
Right.
And we've reached the end of our time together. Thank you so very much, all of you, for coming.
Thank
This
you.
is a free lecture with Jim Feil. We are hosting other workshops, both virtually and in person. And I'll send out the recording and more information to you this just later on today.
Great. Great. Well, Kate, thank you again for organizing this, making it available.
Thank you for coming, Jim, and giving us your wisdom. And thank you all for coming and listening and being a part of our learning community. See you all next time.
Okay, bye. Great.
Thank you.